How does alcohol cause crime? Can alcohol be used as a psychiatric defense in a criminal trial? Hello, cruel world. This is part 2 of a 3-part series that I've made relating to lots of different aspects of alcohol and its relationship with both psychiatric disorders and also offending. This channel is a 𝗏𝗏𝐿𝐴. It's the only YouTube channel that covers true crime and mental illness that's hosted by a professional consultant forensic psychiatrist. I'm your host, Dr. Sohom Das. I assess mentally disordered offenders for a living so that you don't have to. I also act as an expert witness for criminal courts, and I have to say that alcohol intoxication is very common in the patient group that I see and for the assessments that I do for courts. In fact, I would go as far as to say there are more people that commit crimes under the influence of being drunk that I see than people who are actually seriously mentally unwell. So in this video, I'm going to answer the questions: what's the relationship between alcohol and offending, and when can alcohol be used as a psychiatric defense? I'm also going to tell you about a real life case of mine which is related to alcohol. So sit back, grab an age appropriate drink, and welcome to a 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏 So alcohol's association with offending, well, the most common and the most obvious mechanism is through acute intoxication. So people get drunk, they become disinhibited, sometimes they become violent, they don't care about the consequences of their actions, they might be easily provoked, like the example from part 2 of this series, into violence, and this is extremely common in the case that I see. In fact, for all you stat fans out there, half of those people that commit an assault are drunk at the time, and 2/3 of those who kill other people are drunk at the time. And it also increases your chance of being a victim of violence. So around 1/3 of assault victims are drunk at the time of the assault. Often, when people are drunk, their behavior can be completely erratic. So it can be very unusual, not just compared to the average normal person, but actually it can be unusual for what they do, even when they're drunk in the past. So what that means is that once in a while, either the defendant or the defendant's lawyer believe that it must be driven by mental illness somehow because the actions are just so wild. So they instruct me to assess them, but actually it's the alcohol intoxication that led to this inhibition, not mental illness. As opposed to, for example, schizophrenia leading to people hearing voices, telling them to hurt other people and feeling that compelled to those voices. Occasionally you get a mixture of the two, so you get mental illness and you get alcohol, and somebody's mentally unwell and they're drunk, which makes it really hard to disentangle. So when I get cases like these, I have to spend hours looking through all the evidence with a fine-tooth comb to figure out exactly what the perpetrator's thought process was at the time of the offence. Another connection is dependence. So I explained and described the symptoms of dependence syndrome in my previous episode. A lot of people have dependence and they offend purely to have the funds and the resources to get their hands in more booze or drugs. So they might shoplift actual booze, or they might shoplift other items to sell, or they might commit robberies or burglaries. Another mechanism, which is not that common to be honest, is the withdrawal states. So as I described in the last episode, some people go through extreme agitation or paranoia when they're withdrawing from alcohol, so they can lash out with violence. So you might want to know the answer to the question, can intoxication be a legal defense? The short answer is yes, but very rarely. So obviously being intoxicated alters a person's mental state, it affects their decision-making capability. However, it cannot usually be used as a legal defense, such as a defense of not guilty by reason of insanity. This kind of makes sense because if you think about it, anybody who is intoxicated could absolve themselves of responsibility for their actions by just getting drunk. So you could actually intend to commit a crime. Say you wanted to murder your deadbeat husband for leaving the toilet seat up just one too many times. And then you can intentionally drink so that you become intoxicated. You can say, act like a prat in public so that lots of potential witnesses can see you, and then you can do the act and then try and use alcohol as a defense. So it makes sense that you can't do that. However, very rarely it can be a defense if it's involuntary intoxication. So for example, if somebody spiked a person's drink and they became intoxicated and committed a crime. But obviously this is quite hard to prove. You might need a toxicology blood test report to prove that there's some dodgy substances in your blood. Or another scenario is if you take a drug that's prescribed by a doctor and it's interacted with alcohol and it makes you act erratically and you commit a crime. So in that scenario, even though the drug was taken voluntarily, it's considered non-voluntary because it's taken under the instructions of a doctor. Again, this is very hard to prove, so it rarely actually works as a successful defense, but it does occasionally. I think I've seen it twice in my career that I can remember. Another time that it can be used as a defense, and this is controversial to me, I don't know what you think, you might not think that it's fair like I do, and that is when somebody is dependent on a substance. If they're suffering withdrawal and they have a big impulse to take alcohol, then their actions trying to get hold of the alcohol can potentially have a psychiatric defense. So to be specific, say you've run out of your special brew, because I know you love drinking that, and you've got the shakes really, really bad. So you drive out to your local offie so you can pick up your next can, and you accidentally run over the neighbour's cat. So now if you can convince a forensic psychiatrist, and if he writes a report, and if that report can convince a judge, then your act of cat slaughter could be dropped. Having committed an offence when you're intoxicated simply because the drink was much stronger than you expected it to be is not a psychiatric defense, so don't try it. Okay, we're going to take a quick break, and after that I'm going to tell you about another real life case of mine. So, welcome to A Psych for Sore Minds. I'm your host, Dr. Sohom Das. I'm a consultant forensic psychiatrist. I assess and rehabilitate mentally disordered offenders, or what the tabloids might call the criminally insane. I do this in prisons and in courts and in secure psychiatric units. I live and work in London. I also act as an expert witness, so I advise judges in criminal courts across the UK. This channel here that you're watching dissects a whole range of mental health topics, some of which are related to offending, like this one, some of which are not. My USP, I think, and the reason I think you should watch me, is because I talk about my real life cases. I release new episodes every Tuesday and every Wednesday, so you need to subscribe or you're going to miss out and your life will be worse. There's something for everybody on this channel. Okay, so next up, I'm going to tell you about the case of Mr. G. This is another case that I've personally assessed, and it's about a man with alcoholism who was charged with perverting the course of justice. So Mr. G had apparently phoned emergency services from outside a train station on 4 separate occasions within the space of about a week or two, and every single time he was very drunk. And each time he claimed that he had been robbed, and this actually led to a totally innocent man being arrested by the police and being kept in police custody overnight. And it was only later when they obtained the CCTV footage that it became apparent that Mr. G was making this all up. So not only had he wasted police time, but he'd really ruined the evening of a random stranger. So when questioned, Mr. G stated that he had very little memory of the events in question, or in fact the entire period of time, because he was drinking about 1 to 2 litres of vodka every day, which I'm sure you'll agree is quite an excessive quantity of alcohol, even if you're Polish. Look at Mr. G's background. So his early life was marred by his father's own heavy drinking, which would lead his father to become violent and volatile at home. Mr. G was an estate agent since his early 20s, and he worked in this field on and off for many years. So it's actually quite a sad story to sort of picture how it all escalated. So he used to have a drink in the pub with his estate agent colleague mates after work, and this increased more and more. It went from 1 drink to 2 drink until he started coming back home later and later, and then he graduated from beer to spirits. He was eventually fired from his job due to drinking at lunchtime, coming back smelling of booze, and some of the customers complained. He also had a marriage for only about a year, and that broke up again because of his drinking, and after that he became homeless for a few months. And during this time period he would do some very inexplicable things whilst he was drunk, like he would jump on a train and travel miles for no particular reason, and he'd also have periods of confusion. So for example, he once found himself naked in a random park covered in cuts and bruises, and he didn't remember what happened, didn't remember how he got there. So as you can see, it's quite a bleak picture that I'm painting, and he had Mr. G had many different social consequences to his alcohol use, from his job to homelessness to his marriage. And on top of all of that, for about a year before his offending, he described what sounded like withdrawal symptoms to me. So he'd feel itchy and very anxious, and his heart would pound. So typically he would start drinking from early in the morning to stop this feeling, and I think that was the turning point. That's what really ruined his life, from a very heavy, dangerous drinker to a full-blown alcoholic. So as I mentioned earlier, Mr. G claimed that he had memory lapses for the offences, but it's actually irrelevant whether somebody remembers their offence or not in terms of the trial and in terms of clinical responsibility. Which kind of makes sense if you think about it, because if that did decrease your criminal responsibility, then anybody can just say that they didn't remember the offence, because it's quite easy for people to claim that, and it's actually very hard to prove or disprove. So in terms of my conclusions in my court report, I felt that Mr. G was intoxicated, obviously, during the time of his offence, and his ability to make judgments was affected, his mental capacity would be affected, but as I said before, it was voluntary intoxication, so that ruled out any psychiatric defence. So I could not, despite what his barrister was trying to get me to do, I could not make a finding of not guilty by reason of insanity. Instead, what I did is I diagnosed alcohol dependence syndrome. So it had never been formally diagnosed before, never presented to his doctors, to a psychiatrist, or to alcohol services at that point in his life. But he had all the classic symptoms. He had a compulsion to drink. He had difficulties in controlling his substance-taking behaviour. He had a physiological withdrawal state, tolerance, progressive neglect of other activities, and persistence in using substances despite all the damage it was doing, from losing his job to his wife. And there was clear evidence that it was ruining his life. So what I suggested to the court was that if they were minded to serve a custodial sentence, because it's ultimately up to the judge, if they thought he needed to go to prison, then obviously Mr. G would need to go through a detox to help him with his intense withdrawal symptoms, and he'd probably need to go to the special detox wing in the prison so that he would be given sedatives. Not only would that help him with withdrawal, but it would also decrease the risk of life-threatening seizures. And I also suggested that he could engage with drug and alcohol services in the prison. But however, if the judge was feeling lenient and feeling empathetic, then he might consider a community order with alcohol treatment requirements. So that is because Mr. G's offending was all in the context of being inebriated. So it follows that if he can control his alcohol intake, and if he can treat his dependence syndrome, then that would significantly decrease the risk of him offending in the future. So this means that he'd have to tie in with his local alcohol rehab services. They would have to supervise him regularly. They might do blood tests, they might do breath tests. So he has to prove to them that he's not drinking. And on top of that, he would have to attend a certain amount of therapy, for example, 2 sessions per week. Those are his conditions. If he breaks any of those conditions of the community order, then he might end up going to prison at a later date. Now, by the time I assessed Mr. G, he was on bail, and he'd already enrolled himself into a residential rehabilitation program. I think the prospect of spending years in jail was a wake-up call for him, even more than losing his job, more than losing his wife. And I think what happened was the judge was quite impressed with his motivation, so he gave him a chance, and Mr. G luckily managed to dodge a prison sentence. So if you need any help with alcohol, if you know anyone that's got problems, then please reach out to the resources which are linked at the bottom in the comment section. Okay, so let's take a quick break, then I'm going to tell you my take-home message from my alcohol series. So I hope you've enjoyed my 3-part series on alcohol. What is the take-home message? My advice to you is to drink responsibly. And if you're not going to do that, don't commit any offences. And if you are going to commit offences, do not use alcohol intoxication as a defence. And if you end up in prison, don't make prison hooch. Before we finish, I have some questions for you, dear viewer. Have you had an experience of being an alcoholic or living with somebody who suffers from alcoholism? And if so, if it's not too forward, would you be kind enough to share some of those experiences? I'm genuinely interested to know, and I think our other viewers would as well. Obviously, you can remain anonymous. So tell me, similarly, if you've ever had the experience of overcoming alcoholism, or anybody that's close to you, then please share your story as well. Also, if there's anybody that's brave enough to tell me about any kind of impulsive decisions that you might have made whilst you're intoxicated, then I'd love to hear them. Hopefully nothing too dangerous or anything that involves hurting anybody, otherwise you'll put me in an awkward situation. Okay, next I'm going to take a break and tell you about what's coming up in a Psych for Sore Minds. So guys, I'm very excited to share with you the news that I'm going to be a speaker at CrimeCon UK in June 2021. It's a massive convention, really popular in the States, and it's coming to the UK. If you're a true crime enthusiast, you cannot miss out. To cop your tickets, look at the link below and use the code PSYCH for 10% off. So coming up on this channel in the next few weeks, there's going to be lots of true crime, high profile cases, lots of mental illness topics. Sorry, I can't be more specific, but I've got lots planned, but I have yet to decide what I'm going to do in which order. Please forgive my sloppiness and my disorganization, but maybe you'll find it in your hearts to subscribe to my channel, please. Not only does it help me out immeasurably, but it also raises your personal IQ by 10 points. I guarantee it. I'd love for you to comment more, so please let me know your thoughts, reach out, have a little chat with me, I will answer back. Please follow us on Instagram and on Facebook, like our page, submit an episode idea, get in touch at our email, which is psychforsoreminds@gmail.com. If you're going to reference us, use hashtag PsychSore. Finally, please tell your favorite people about a Psych for Sore Mind because they deserve it and you know it. Spread the love. Until next time, stay euthymic and remember I love you. That's enough for now. Please go away.